All right, hi and welcome. This is a focus on how I came up with this particular new composition. This is a Pattern Jazz, The City at Night 5. This is actually the second one I've been working on, but it's 5 because I've been using a video loop, and it's the fifth one that I found. And I was actually doing some work recently trying to find some additional sounds for some other compositions, and I started off and it became this organic thing, and it actually turned into its own composition. So probably like you, if you're doing something with Eurorack, you often start with one thing. It could be one sound or one modulation source that's modulating a sound, and then that becomes the basis of something. You add to that, and over time it starts to have, maybe like in this case, an organic feel to it. So the beginning of this actually was with the Clouds module, and what I wanted to do was utilize the stereo outs of it. And so I actually took a very simple bass sound, which I'm triggering, nothing too amazing with the modulation, but I have a variety of different sources. So I like to use my two Pico trigger modules, and then I often have been using Hermid, the sequencer, more for modulation sources, LFOs, and so forth. So I found that starting with the rhythmic simplicity of the Pico trigger modules, which you can program to any rhythm source you want, and I typically will start with like a simple in 4/4, like a quarter note in this one, maybe eighth notes on the next. On the third one, it could be something syncopated and so forth. And I actually have two of those, and this particular trigger module then is my master clock for everything. So it's pretty easily accomplished if you use some of the passive multiples and you take multiple outs out, and then I can actually use that to clock pressure points, which I'm using for modulation. I can use the CV in on Hermid for the same thing, right, to clock that in time. In this particular version, I'm using Chance, the qubit Chance as well, so that's getting a clock source. And then over here, I have the 2HP div module that also is getting a clock source, and I'm dialing in the two controls so that I can create some polyrhythms or other rhythmic sources for some of these tracks. That's kind of all the clock stuff going on. And again, the first thing being triggered is the Planck module. I'm splitting that out, so I have one going into one channel of Clouds. The other one is routed over to 2HP, the Freeze module, which is giving me like a different timbre, kind of a graininess, a harsher sound, and that's coming back into the other channel of Clouds. And I'm using, in this particular version, the resonator. I'm using the Parasite firmware 2.0, which I'm just absolutely amazed with. And what you'll be hearing in this is this, essentially, I guess you would say it's a drum loop, but it's really coming from this bass sound, which is being triggered in some pretty simple senses. I'm using things like the pitch in, triggering that as well, and I'll be triggering the volt per octave on Clouds, a few of the other inputs, the modulation inputs, and that's adding rhythms in a sense. So there's like a downbeat that you'll actually hear, which is just a really simple trigger for my Pico out into the volt per octave. And it's creating almost like what sounds like a drum pattern, but the cool thing about this is when it starts, it has nothing that even sounds rhythmic, and it's all the modulation combined that's creating for this rhythmic complexity. And then what I will do in the song is adjust the various parameters on Clouds, and these are different than the stock. So what I recommend is downloading there's a cheat sheet that comes with the Parasite firmware that's really good, and it tells you what all these functions are. Some of them stay the same, but like the texture becomes essentially a filter. The pitch, I think, is the same. So in any case, that is the first sound that you'll be hearing, and I'll be playing with that throughout. I'm also doing a drum part, percussion with my hands, and so I'm trying to figure out right now exactly how I'm going to, I want to change quite a few of these parameters during this mix, and I need to do it all in one take, so I'm a little concerned about jumping back and forth and adjusting this and fine-tuning it. So we'll see how that goes. The next 2 channels, I am doing a simple trigger of my pluck module 2HP, which has become strangely one of my go-to modules for just like string drones. There's not a lot to this module, but it sounds absolutely amazing. And since the last 2019 NAMM convention, I know they're releasing a new one called Bell, which I probably wouldn't normally buy because I can get Bell sounds on Planck. But given what this does in terms of a string module, I think I'd have to seriously consider that. Plus, in 2HP, you know, you can't go wrong. It takes up so little space in terms of your cases. So you're hearing that, and that's going into the Pico DSP, and I have it on one of the reverb settings. And what I often do is I start with my first track, my rhythm one. As I added this next track, which is going to be in stereo, I first dialed in a couple of modulation parameters, and then I worked on the DSP sound that would work, and I also have that modulated. And as usual, it's almost impossible to try to map this all out in any sensible way. So that's kind of the uniqueness of Eurorack, is that it has a one and done mentality to it, which I think is absolutely about like creativity and creating one-of-a-kind sounds and modulations and clock sources. But in case you're curious, the div module, which I also dialed in the rate, is going into the mix input on the Pico DSP. And the Pico DSP, when I first got it, I thought it didn't have all that much potential, but now as I'm learning to use it a little bit, it adds a nice timbre quality to some of my sound sources, so that is quite good, I think, in this case. Next is track 5 is the Muskrat module, one of the 3, and that is, I think, this first one here. I have 3 of them. I put in different chips on each one, which is one of the cool things about those modules, is you can fine-tune the sounds really nicely, and then you can swap in different chips, which allows you to create some new sounds and something new without buying a new module. And that is then just simply being fed into the Ventris reverb, which is not pictured, it's off screen below me here. And I have that on the mod reverb, which I think gives it a kind of unique sound. It almost has like a tremolo effect, a chorusy type effect. So you'll be hearing that. 6 is one of my favorite modules, that's radio music, which is up here. And I have a stock like choir sound. I think these were some free loops I downloaded recently. And just by dialing in the station and the start point, modulating 3 of the points, one is the simple trigger going in, I came up with this particular sound, which has a much different sonic quality to it as well as a rhythmic quality. In addition, I have 2 downer pedals. You'll hear one of these. I have it plugged in the harmonizer to a 7th. You'll hear that change now. So you can hear a different sound there. And then as well, I have a modulation, the downer modulation pedal. Plug that in. And I will probably adjust the rate. And I think what's cool about that is you can do sort of syncopated things and offbeat, polyrhythmic sort of things using that. In this function, it's almost like a delay, how I'm using it. I think it's just the simple tremolo, and I'm adjusting the rate and so forth. So that's track 6. Track 7 is plates. And this one is, I have it going into the fold module here. And I'm using maths, and I can adjust that as I play, perhaps. A little bit. This is one of these I have to say, sometimes I will have, because I have 16 or so channels on the mixer, I often will record an extra track like that. It doesn't really, as you're hearing it now, sound all that interesting. I can do some post-production stuff with it. I can really alter it up with some effects, and maybe it'll come in as a accent piece for some of the rhythm tracks to give some variety. Maybe it will come in as a little interlude or something that is just going to lead into a new section depending on what I do with the video. So it doesn't hurt to throw in an extra track. It's just another track on my USB drive, so not a big deal. Next is 2 channels, 8 and 9. And this is, I'm triggering the peak of voice. I found a sound, and I'm running that through the 2 HP verb. And again, as usual, I'm adjusting the damper and the different, the time and so forth, the mix amount, and also modulating both in some fairly simple ways. And just finding a sound that I thought was interesting. And again, I may go in and adjust that as I'm playing. Track 11, so we'll pull in now. Sorry, track 10. Take out 8 and 9. Track 10 is, this is another one. I'm essentially taking, I'm forgetting which one this is. Oh, I'm taking my tracks 1 and 2, which is the loop, because I split it out here and had the extra opportunity to take those same duplicate audio tracks. I plugged one into the Fusion VCO, which is giving this really grainy sound, distorted sound, very overdriven sound. And again, that's one that maybe will not be used later on when I do the final mix. We'll see how that works. But it has a certain quality to it that I thought could be unique in the final mix. I have one more track that is a Eurorack related track. That's this one. And what I'm doing is taking another mix from the Planck module, the audio out. I'm routing that into, it's off screen, but my looper, my Roland 505 looper, and I'm just using the synthesizer. I'm using it only for an effect sound in this case. And it's another version of throwing it down here and hoping that later in the mix I'll be able to bring that in and have something rhythmically and sonically that I can use later. And it also provides some variety. Right now you're hearing 1 and 2 and 11. And 11 is a much, I don't want to say purer, but it's a simplified version of what's being played via Planck and clouds, right? There's a lot of rhythmic stuff going on because of all the triggering coming in both in Planck and in clouds, mainly clouds. Clouds with that resonator firmware Parasite 2.0 is really doing something that is very different and unique in terms of the rhythms and the sounds it's creating. So that's an additional track. Now, in addition to all that, I'm going to pull down those tracks and let's pull up 10. So we're going to pull up 11, 12, and 13. We're going to pull up 12, 13, and 14. And for this, let me just do a quick camera shift here so you can see what we're working with. All right, so this particular song we'll be using this percussion instrument. And I'm going to be playing it like I did in Pattern Jazz 1 with the Mac as the backdrop. And I'll be playing the instrument and then doing two things with it. One is I'm taking the output, the piezo output that I put in. This is a homemade spring percussion instrument I created some time back, actually using the box that comes with the blue microphone, which is just right here. If you get the blue microphone, it comes in this absolutely massive box, and it's almost like a cardboard type box. And you're hearing some triggering here. I actually decided to use it as sort of a resonator, and I added all these springs and created this percussion instrument. So what I'll be doing is playing it with a variety of mallets and 3 sound sources. So the first one you'll hear is just, let's take out those 2 tracks, is just the piezo. So you're hearing this. It's going to be affected, of course, in post-production. I will have to EQ it and also do some effects. And it's one of those things that has almost a harsh sound to it in some ways, just because of the springs bouncing and the metal and the reverberations going around. The other thing I'm doing, though, is I wanted to use my outputs, an additional piezo out. I took that, I ran that through the system, and let me move the camera back here. This is a case where I need a second camera, but I didn't want to set it up. But what I'm doing is I have it running in two, I have 2 mutable things, music ears modules. And these are very cool because you can tap on them and then generate basically a higher amplified out of an acoustic sound, and you can also use that acoustic sound to do envelope following. So I can do side chains. I can create then some curious sounds by taking that actual piezo output, which is an audio output, adding that, layering that with some electronic sounds. What I had to do is this, and this is a bit of a tip when you're using one of these modules. Initially, I ran the piezo out into one of the ears modules, and when I was hitting the springs, as you saw there, and this is going to be triggering two muskrat modules, which are also being modulated by the outs from this and from some additional gate sources here and there, such as from pressure points, which is doing the most of the work. But what I found was when I was doing that, I was getting a bit of a delay, or I was not getting an actual trigger. And so I would hit it and then wasn't hearing it. I have to hit it really hard. I don't necessarily want to hit it so hard in some cases. So what I did was I simply took the piezo into the first ears module. I took my little mini 3.5 cord here and I plugged it into the second ears. So I'm getting basically double amplification or attenuation. What I'm doing is, as I'm playing the instrument, and again, I don't have this right next to my instrument, so I can't show you that, but as I'm hitting the drum like this, I have this one pretty much maxed out here at like 5 o'clock, which is the max, and then the one that's getting the initial signal from the piezo in, I have right now at about 9 o'clock. And what I did was I started playing the springs, and I was trying to get to a point of where I was hitting it at the right velocity, right? This is almost like on a drum pad, your velocity or your sensitivity that you'd be adjusting in an electronic sense on the instrument. In this case, because it's an acoustic, I'm doing that here. So I'm hitting the drum like this, and then I'm constantly just moving, dialing back from 12 o'clock to 10 o'clock and then down to 9 o'clock. And that's the point where the velocity seems right as I'm hitting the drum in terms of triggering the module. And then that module's triggered into the carp. Not into the carp, I'm sorry, into the two muskrats. And let's go back to the drum then. So again, here is just the acoustic. Okay, and then we'll add one of the muskrats. Now what I can do is I can go back to the muskrat and I can adjust the first parameter. I could adjust the first parameter and I can change the decay or the sustain of the sound. And I'll try to make it a little shorter here. And then, so that's the first muskrat, here's the second one. And so what I'm hoping is, again, some of this is trial and error, is that the combination of the acoustic sounds and those electronic sounds from the two muskrat modules being triggered by ears will produce something unique that will go along with the electronic tracks. And so the idea here is I will be playing along with the Eurorack track. I'm setting it out to be about like 40 minutes of music, doing two things, playing this and also trying to go in and adjust the parameters on some of the modules, particularly those first two tracks of the Plonk and Clouds playing together. What I'm hoping to do with this in the future is eventually develop an electroacoustic instrument so that I can play an instrument like this and trigger multiple electronic modules, use effects to create something that has a true hybrid approach in terms of the acoustic from the piezos and then triggering those electronic modules and adding some effects. So that is it for now. We'll see how this turns out, and you can check out the final product once it's complete.